Hello and welcome to The Appetite, a podcast brought to you by Opal Food and Body Wisdom, an eating disorder treatment clinic in Seattle, Washington. It is a podcast about all things food, body, movement, and mental health. I'm Bazzi, a co-founder, clinical director, and the director of the Exercise+Sport program at Opal, as well as your host for today. On today's episode, I will be having a discussion with Christine Yu, author of Up to Speed, the groundbreaking science of women athletes. I first became connected to Christine's work when she interviewed me for a piece she did on WebMD entitled, "We Need to Talk About Body Image in Female Athletes." I got excited to learn about her journalism work that focuses on the intersection of sports science and women athletes. And then to find out she was writing a book, I was even more thrilled knowing that our resources are so limited in this space. So I'm delighted to have her on our podcast and share her knowledge and wisdom. So welcome, Christine.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, this is great. And I think just first off, I would love to start by naming and talking about the focus on women athletes. And I know you address this in your book, but just to lay a foundation for our listeners, let's talk about the gender binary that is often found in sports space and research. And I'd love for you to speak on your experience with gender constructs as it relates to the research you did for this book and why you chose to focus on athletes that identify as female.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important idea and concept, especially coming into a book, right, whose subtitle is The Groundbreaking Science of Women Athletes. So science and sports are both really interesting in that they are two fields that are very much predicated on the gender and sex binary, right? So in science, I mean, everything is kind of split male, female, right? Because science is all about trying to minimize variability and trying to find kind of general understandings of how things work, how we can categorize things, how we can understand things. And so they want to have these kind of clear categories in order to advance that knowledge, right? And similarly, in a way, right, with sports, we have the male, female, men's, women's category in sport. Again, it's this way to kind of categorize people. But when we do that and we only have these two categories, we make a lot of assumptions around what that means and what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. And so what I was trying to do with this book, I mean, I'll back up a little bit and say that, when I first started thinking about this, it was really interesting to think about. It's like, oh my gosh, women are left out of all the scientific research. Like, what does that mean for girls and women in the sport? And when I first started researching and thinking about this, it was very much like I expected to focus on kind of, all these sex differences between men and women and really understands like, yes, men do it this way, women do it this way. But really, as I kind of dug into it a little bit more, realizing that we can't kind of bucket people in those ways. We can't kind of bucket just men, just women, and expect them to be these like wholly different categories of folks, right? Because the fact is that we're all human. So the reality is that there is a lot more overlap between us as men, as women, as, someone in a male body and someone in a female body than there really are differences. I'm not saying that there aren't any differences, but the fact is like I often describe it as almost like this Venn diagram, right? So you kind of have the like male/men circle on one side, the women/female circle on the other, and it does overlap. But the fact is that we don't actually know how much of that overlap exists, or really what exists in that like female only, women only side of things. We know a lot about that sliver, and that's just the men and the male bodies. So that was kind of really important for me to kind of think about. It's like, well, yes, there are these differences, but also what are the commonalities between this? And so, in the book, I try to, one way I was trying to do this was really think intentionally about the language that I was using and really intentionally only use male, female when I'm describing something biological or physiological or anatomical, when not as a way to describe any one person, and to, try to use as much inclusive language as I could, understanding that, gender and sex very much exists on a spectrum. And then, to your question as to like why this is really important and why kind of focusing on women athletes in particular, that, it really is when you think about the fact that like we've for so long studied men, particularly in the field of sports, men have always been centered, both in term, their experience has been, what this whole system has been built up around. And so when you think about that, for me, it was important to think about, well, who's not centered in that conversation? Obviously women, but then it's, it also includes, non-binary folks. It also includes trans folks. So, when I talk about thinking about women athletes and like the experience of someone who, identifies as a woman athlete, I think it also speaks to this broader conversation of, lots of folks who have been marginalized by sex and gender and what that experience might, not their entire experience, but like how by understanding more than just men's experience, we can actually better understand, right? Like a more inclusive understanding of like lots of different people instead of just men.
Yeah,
If that
totally.
makes sense.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And it just makes me curious too, when you were looking at the research, obviously seeing the underrepresentation of women, did you find research studies that were looking at some of these ideas with non-binary or trans folks? Were there
Yeah,
studies even that exist?
not very much. And again, so this is also a couple of years ago now, right? So when I first started really reporting and researching for the book, that's like 2020 into like the first half of like 2022. So even at that point in time, there definitely were not, I don't recall really coming across many or any studies around like non-binary folks. There were maybe a handful of studies that were looking at trans athletes, but it was really small. And that's in part why, there isn't, say, like a specific chapter on like trans athletes in my book, because there just wasn't anything to really talk about, very concretely at that time. But yeah, it was very much still like men, 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 a study on women, men, 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 men.
Yeah, totally. It's interesting too to think of your work in journalism and how we are starting to see more articles and media come out about trans athletes or non-binary athletes. So yeah, just curious too about sort of that lag time between the research and the application and then what we're seeing in media.
Yeah, and that's probably one of the more frustrating things about science is how long it takes to do things, how long it takes to, recruit, to put together a study, recruit for the study, run the study, analyze the data, and then go through the publication process, right? And for the most part, like you do need those published results that, in a peer-reviewed journal, in order for that, those findings and kind of that evidence to be concrete, right? And to be valid and accepted, if you will. But that takes so long.
Yeah.
It takes so long. And science is very much an incremental field where you're slowly building up this evidence base. And so it can take a really long time until you can build consensus and have things like guidelines, evidence-based guidelines and the like, which can be really frustrating for a person who is in it, right? In the thick of it, who is looking for advice or looking for something. And so it's kind of this interesting tension between, you do want the science, you do want it to be validated, but at the same time, and like media needs kind of that validated sources in order to report on it. But then at the same time, you want to be, telling more of these stories. You want to be kind of pushing the field in some way.
Yeah, totally. And I think being in the clinical world, yeah, we can feel that just impatience of, but this is what we're seeing clinically and it's in front of us. And we know that we need to have these conversations and what are best practices and how are these different, what is the overlap between those similarities and the differences in the lived experiences and what athletes need. I don't remember if you said this in your book, but did you give sort of a sense of how many years that takes from kind kind of science research to the translation to practice?
Yeah, so there's one statistic that kind of stood out that I kept coming across, and it's 17 years.
17. Okay.
So,
That's a long
right,
time.
if you think about it, like that's an adolescent child. Like that's
Yes,
the,
that is.
it's like that's the age of my son who's,
Wow.
going to be leaving for school, like for college next year. But it's like
17.
how it's bananas how
Wow.
long that takes,
Wow.
right?
Yeah. I would have thought, I was thinking 5-ish. So 17. Wow. That's a long time.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I'm sure, right,
Yeah.
that varies by the field and so I think that, particularly in this realm of like athlete health and performance related, to women athletes, I think that the researchers are very cognizant of this tension and of the desire, right? And like the need for, some sort of guidance or something now, that they are trying to figure out ways to translate that work a little bit faster, right? To
Yeah.
kind of shorten that pipeline, or to figure out ways that they can set up their studies in such a way that they can provide a little bit more concrete guidance.
Yeah, I think of the Female Athlete Conference that takes place in Boston that I know you did a book signing last year. And that seems like such a huge part of that conference is having the researchers there, having the clinicians, and trying to bridge that gap and have clinicians have access to that research, have coaches have access to that research to inform the way they are going to work with people. So, yeah, I know that is a main hope of that conference. Okay, well, let's change gears a bit and get to know you a little bit more too as author of the book. So I'd love just for listeners to hear the why behind how did you get into this in your journalism work and into the book? Like what personally interested you or what drew you to doing this in your career?
Yeah, so I've always been kind of interested in, sports science and performance, in part because I tend to be injured or have been injured a bunch in my life. So trying to figure out ways I'm like, maybe I won't be injured so much. So I've always been kind of interested in that realm. And then I remember specifically, it was about 10 years ago, I was at this fitness magazine event. It was for editors and writers in New York City. And there was a doctor talking about female athlete triad. And it was actually the first time that I had heard that specific term. I had always, growing up, I'd heard like, yeah, if you are really fit or you train a lot, you lose your period. And it's kind of like, oh, okay. Kind of just as everyone, right? It's like this accepted fact that happens. And at some point, like it never really dawned on me to like really wonder why. But as she was talking about it and really talking about this interconnection between nutrition and energy intake and how that affects hormones and how that then affects bone health, it made me really mad because, the thing that I remember her saying was that, how the menstrual cycle really plays a role in bone building and how important that is during adolescence, and how adolescence is that period of time where you are just laying down bone, and what you lay down, you can't make up if you don't reach your full potential. And it really, like I said, it made me really mad because I was like, why? Like, why didn't I know this information when I was younger? Because I feel like that's kind of important information to know. And it would have been really useful too, in terms of thinking of my own relationship with like my body and eating and all of this stuff. And I was also mad because like, why didn't anyone ever tell me that my menstrual cycle was so important outside of just like maybe being pregnant or not, right? Like that's all you learn about it. You don't learn about all these other amazing things that the hormones do. So that kind of like stuck with me and like, made me upset because like if I'm someone who is very interested in this type of information in this field, I'm, writing about it, I'm talking to people about it. And I don't know this information. I'm pretty sure like a lot of other people don't know this information. So that was kind of like the genesis of it, and really trying to want to write more about female athlete health and, how that intersects with performance and like overall health and well-being. And yeah, and it kind of, I never really wanted to write a book, but I had started writing a bunch of articles for Outside Magazine, which had been really great because my editor there had allowed me to really explore a lot of different topics and kind of different angles related to this. But yeah, my agent had read a bunch, and she's like, "I think there's a book here." And I was like, "That's fun. That's nice. Like, we can move on from that." But yeah, but it made me realize that, if I were ever to write a book, this would be the thing that I would want to write about, because this is a thing that I have been writing about and that I really do care about in understanding and kind of, furthering our information and our understanding about what's happening here.
Yeah, I'm so glad you did. I mean, again, I know that there's more coming out through articles and media, but in books, we're really lacking in books with good sound information about it. And I'm so glad that you wrote this. Yeah.
And part of it too was this frustration that, I felt like we kept kind of writing the same article over and over again. Like, eating disorders are bad, prevalent in sports, bone stress injuries, or, all of these things, or concussions and ACL tears. But it never went anywhere. It was like, oh my God, this is a terrible thing. And then, it died down. And then it was again next year, oh my God, this is a terrible thing. And so part of my motivation with this too was I really wanted to put kind of under one umbrella all of this information, because, I figured there had to be some sort of connecting thread between these ideas, between like kind of our menstrual cycles and bone health and eating and, you know, injury and, different life phases. And I wanted to just, like I said, just kind of sew it all together, if you will, and put it all in one place.
Yeah, as a one-stop shop for all of the information.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was really impressive. I think that was, one of the things that really struck me is how you tied all those things together, incorporated a large variety of this athlete's stories. And I'm so happy that you picked athletes of multiple sports. I felt like that was really important. And integrating all the research. So, and to do that in a way that's understandable and interesting. I mean, that was really, I was reading it, I remember, on a road trip and with my two teenage girls in the car and just thinking, wow, oh, this is great. Just so excited about, again, how you constructed the book and created something that is easily digestible and then had so many that you're tying so much together. So amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, so you said some of this: hormones, menstruation, early sport specialization, sport and aging, breasts, and more. So I did find myself curious in having a conversation with you if there was any particular topic that you found personally the most captivating, the most interesting, and also like an area that you think deserves more myth busting, like where we kind of have it wrong in the way that people perceive something. I don't know. I was just curious about both of those things.
Yeah, in terms of the area that was personally most interesting to me, I think it was the research around injuries. I mean, like I said, because I have been injured a bunch, and I've had 3 ACL surgeries at this point now, and really trying to understand kind of what was happening there, why that was happening. Because again, this is, talking specifically about ACLs, it's not new news. We've known the disparities in the injuries between men and women, since like the late 80s, early 90s. But what I really wanted to understand was like, why hasn't anything changed? And, really trying to dig into that a little bit too. And then I think for me personally, so much of the injury model or the way that we talk about injury is like innate risk factors versus external risk factors. So again, with something like ACL injuries, it's like your Q angle and depending on like how wide your hips are and your hormone levels, because your ligaments might be more lax at certain points of the menstrual cycle. or all these things that had to relate to your body, which you can't really do that much about, right? It's like my hips are as wide as my hips are. I'm like, I can't like make them wider, or I can't, shrink them. I mean, without doing something really drastic, right? Um, but like and it kind of, at least for me, it always made me feel like, well, it sucks to be you. You're just going to be injured. Like that's just your luck of the draw, right? There was nothing that I could do about it, really, even with the external factors. And even if I took care of X, Y, or Z, or, did the strength training, whatever it is, right? Like there were still these internal innate factors that would put me at higher risk. And I hated that feeling. And so for me, like really looking into the research a little bit more, and there is a kind of like a little bit of a movement, or a little bit of, this changing of how we do think about injury, and really thinking about like moving beyond just the physiological, anatomical, and biological reasons to really take in the wider context around that athlete and the environment in which they're in, the resources that they have. Like all those things play into whether or not you're going to get injured, right? And a lot of those factors also have a gendered slant to them too, right? Just thinking about like, say, like professional soccer players, like the men's team have always been much better resource. They have more staff, usually higher qualified staff too, because they pay those staff better. They have access to facilities, whereas, the women's professional teams haven't always had that. It's starting to get better, in these last several years. But again, just kind of looking at this wider lens, so that again, it's not all on me, right? Like as in like there's nothing I can do about it. So that was really interesting for me. It really made me think about injuries a lot differently, and probably like therapeutically, while or thinking in terms of like therapy wise, it probably helped me, like, with my like mental emotional state around injuries as well.
Totally. I'm thinking of just being in it too, as you're sharing with my teenage girls. I have a junior as well, like you do, who's planning to run distance in college. And so even just looking at different colleges and again, resources and facilities, it varies so greatly from university to university, of a Division I school to these smaller schools, and just what they have available and accessible to them. And when I was at, for example, the University of Washington I graduated in '01, there was a zero 0.5 FTE dietitian and no mental health provider for the entire athletic department. Obviously, things have changed since then. So it's just, yeah, it's speaking to some of those systems variables for sure.
Yeah. And to answer the second part of your question about, the areas where we need more myth busting, it's funny, I was trying to think about this, and like the thing that like always pops into my head is around youth sports and early sports specialization. And it's like, no matter what the research says, like no matter the fact that the research says like doesn't matter, you're more prone to injury, you're more prone to burnout, you're more, it's like all of these negative things. Like in the real world, like everyone is still just so like obsessed with youth sports and professionalizing youth sports and their kids getting college scholarships and like all of these things, that I'm like,
How
that's
do
the
we
one
change
area
that?
I'm like, I really
Right.
want to change that in
Right.
some way. It would make me like, I just feel like we're just doing such a huge disservice to the kids and kind of their longer term, social, emotional, physical health and well-being, right?
Did you
When
find
we
anything with youth athletes in other countries that do it differently and show kind of more long-term longevity and passion and for the sport by doing it
Yeah, I mean, the
differently?
one that always comes up is like, the Scandinavian countries. And I think it is specifically Norway, where they, for their youth, at least, at one point it used to be this way. It's pretty much like low cost, all access, for kids to be involved in sports. There's no ranking of athletes, like adolescent age, teenage age athletes. So there's none of that type of, pressure and like competition in that way. And that it really is around like building solid foundation and love for moving your body and playing sports and being out there. And the fact that it's low cost is huge, right? That like anyone can participate and that there aren't all of these barriers that are keeping people from being able to play sports because they can't afford it or it's not available in their community. And, and then the Scandinavian countries, obviously, especially in the Winter Olympics, right? They
They're
do really
successful.
well, or they seem to have like, their athletes seem to have, more longevity. But yeah,
So interesting. We need to do what Norway does.
I know, right?
But when it's tricky, even like something like social media, it's hard to do something different when the whole community is doing something else. And that's the
Yeah.
trap I think a lot of parents are in is I'd like to do it different, but how do I do that differently when the rest of the community
Yeah.
is doing it this way?
Well, and I always felt like, especially when my kids were younger, so my kids play baseball, but I didn't want them to play travel. Because like I'm not spending thousands of dollars for this, and I don't want to waste my weekends driving all over the place to tournaments and stuff like this. It was a little selfish, but at the same time, like I did feel like I was, kept wondering, am I holding my kids back? Am I doing them a disservice by not having them be part of this because everyone else is doing this, right? So will it get to a point where like all these kids are like so much higher in their skills and out competing my kids, and my kids are again like shut out from it just because like I want them to play rec baseball in the park here in Brooklyn, which is fine when they're like 10, 11, 12,
Totally. Yeah, that's a challenging one. You also mentioned in the book that we have a ways to go with diversifying our research to become more gender inclusive, like we talked about. I'm curious what responses you've received from your book around that and how you see your book as a means to help turn the dial. And I know we kind of touched on that earlier, but I'm curious if there's more you'd want to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I say like it's not like I'm just reporting on the stuff that, these scientists are doing and this amazing work that's happening. And I think that there was a lot of this work going on already, as I was working on the book and as the book has come out. So in a way, like it's a nice coincidence, right? Like I've been able to kind of benefit from that in a way. But yeah, I mean, there has been, like you said, there has been, I think, both a greater recognition of this gender data gap that exists and, frankly, more of a demand from the general public too, to be like, well, why aren't we included? Like, why isn't there information that's suited to me? So I think that it definitely has been helping to raise the profile of the issue to demand more. But it's also a hard thing because scientific research is really expensive, right? So it's not like we can really do like a GoFundMe to raise, like a couple $100,000 to run a clinical trial on, or anything really on something. And so, what I say to folks too, it's like, yes, you can continue to demand more, but, also understanding the constraints that a lot of these researchers are working within. But what you can do as like a private citizen too, is if you are, especially around like a university campus, and you see calls for research participants, participate. Like if you want more research, then like we need people to also participate in that research. A lot of the research, it can be just like a survey, it's nothing like you're not going to be doing like a VO2 max like test or something like that, which not everyone wants to do, but it is something just to consider, right? It's like there's a part for all of us to be able to play in this as well.
I love that. I love that takeaway of that could be a way we're contributing to turning the needle. Was there anything that kind of really delighted you as a response to your book, either from a researcher or athletes or Is there some like anything that kind of stands out? Because your book has been released for over a year, correct?
Yeah, just over a year.
Just over a year. Yeah. Is there, I don't know, anything that surprised you or,
Yeah.
stands out in response?
I think there's like two things that come to mind. One was as I was writing this, I was terrified I was going to get the science wrong or misrepresent someone's work. And I have so much respect for these scientists and researchers and what they do. So for me, like you had mentioned the Female Athlete Conference last year. So that was about a month after the book had come out. And literally, I feel like 80% of the people that I interviewed for the book were at the conference. And so, it was amazing. It felt like a bit, it was amazing for me to be there and see them, to be able to thank them in person, for helping me put this thing together, but then also to hear from them, like their gratitude as well, to have their work showcased, to have this on like, a bigger stage as well. And, to be able to get this information out to an audience that, isn't reading academic journals, right? That isn't following the latest scientific news or anything like that. And so that really like touched me too. And, to be able to kind of have that relationship and kind of, support for each other and in our work, in our different work was really like heartening, and it made me really happy. I'm like such a nerd. I brought my book there and had people sign my book,
Oh,
almost
I
like a
love
yearbook. Because
that.
like, again, it's like
I
this
love
wouldn't
that.
exist without their work,
Yeah.
or their willingness to talk to me or their stories, right? Like I'm just, I think the hardest part for me writing the book was like, I often just saw myself like, I'm a reporter. I'm like gathering information and like putting it together. And my editor kept having to tell me, she's like, this needs more of like your voice in it, like your authorial voice. I'm like, what is that? Like, what does that even
Yeah.
mean?
What does that mean?
She's like,
Oh,
you're the
authorial, like
author.
an author.
Yeah. She's like,
Okay.
you're the authority here and you're
Uh-huh.
the author here. So it needs your point of view as well. And I'm like, it's like really uncomfortable with that for a while.
Mm.
So that was really lovely. And then the other thing, that moment that kind of stands out for me is there's a younger sister of someone on my son's baseball team. I think she's a freshman this year. She plays softball. She read the book, and I saw her kind of at the beginning of the baseball season this year, and she was so excited to meet me. She was like so happy, and like she gave me this big hug, and she was like, it was like a total like fan. I'm like, what is going on? Like this is like so weird, but like, she was just so excited that the book existed and like loved it and like, read it like cover to cover. And I was like, oh my gosh, because that really is the audience that I want to be reading this, right? Like kind of going back to this, what I was saying earlier, I'm like, I wanted this information when I was a teenager to really, because my hope is that if we are able to provide better education, provide better information, like start people talking about this and really just understanding their bodies, just as bodies, right? That we can lay a better foundation so that, girls can start to make better, more informed choices going forward, right? Rather than making decisions based on something they heard or like an assumption or a myth, And so that meant a lot to me to know that, there are girls her age reading it and really getting something out of it.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to have my oldest read it this summer before she goes to
Her
college.
summer reading.
Her summer reading. It's part of her summer reading list. You're sharing about some of the contributors of the book, which a lot of them I know too. So it just warms me to think of that too, of the clinicians and the professionals. And then, of course, the athlete stories as well that you included, which I just really enjoyed hearing those throughout the book. And I felt curious about that too, if there was a particular athlete stories, interviews that you did that personally was meaningful or touched you.
Yeah, it was really important for me to include, like you said, like a variety of different sports in the book because my tendency would just to be include runners because that's what I'm most familiar with. That's what I have mostly reported on. Definitely I'm thinking about this in kind of two different ways. Like one, definitely Mary Cain's story and her op-ed in the New York Times in 2019. That really also was a big catalyst for the book too, because it changed the conversation around REDS and
which is relative energy deficiency in sport. We talk about it a lot on the podcast, but in case this is your first episode.
And so, really change the conversation around that, really change the conversation around like women's experience in sport in general in a way that I had not seen before, right? You could tell that there was something brewing and that there was something going on here. And Mary actually moderated a conversation, was my conversation partner at my event in Boston last year. And she's just been great and, super supportive and wonderful. But in terms of like the athletes that I spoke with specifically for the book, I think, there's a couple of ones, me personally, some of the athletes that I spoke with for the menopause chapter, I mean, mostly because like that's the phase of life I'm entering into. And it was both heartening and terrifying, right? to like hear some of their experiences, but more just in terms of like how gaslit they were about their experience and what they were going through. And no one wanted to hear it. No one wanted to like help or anything like that. But it also gave me, insight into what to expect, but also seeing there's a way through it too, if that makes sense, right? That it's not all doom and gloom and terrible and there's nothing you can do. There's also a rower I spoke with, Jackie Kittle, who is on the New Zealand national rowing team. I'm hoping that she's rowing this summer in the Olympics too. But, she was a lightweight rower, and like lightweight rowers traditionally have done, right? It's like it's all about cutting weight or making weight and, under eating. And the whole New Zealand team, basically I think it was after Rio, they had done a test and realized that everyone except for maybe one was in, kind of in the red, right? Like their energy availability was like way below what they needed to be. They were all having like menstrual irregularities or abstinent menstrual cycles. And so the whole organization shifted, right? And they made a concerted effort in terms of kind of repositioning nutrition and what they needed to do and how important that was. And it became like this organization-wide shift. And all the teammates were kind of supporting each other too, in terms of like encouraging them, not to underfuel, like to make sure everyone was eating. And I remember her saying, at first it's like, it's so hard to do because you're so used to doing it a certain way. And you're so afraid that, if you do it this way, if you eat more, you're going to get worse, right? Because that's the fear. That's what's been kind of bred into you. But when she said, she had said that once she started doing this, like once she kind of got on board, she started eating more. She realized, she's like, I'm not as tired at the end of my workouts. Like I'm not like dead tired and exhausted. And that means I can get through my workouts better. That means like I can actually push myself more in my workouts. That means I am actually getting faster and stronger and better. And will you look at that? I'm not gaining, this ridiculous amount of weight that I was afraid that I was going to gain. And I think just, that kind of idea, right? Like that, fancy that. If you fuel your body, if you give your body what it actually needs, like it will perform. And it just, for me, it really struck in terms of, I grew up in the, 80s, 90s, like everything was about restriction. Everything was about underfueling. Like everything was about like in the magazines that I read, like this ridiculously low number of daily calories I should be eating, right? And it just made me think about like why, like we're forcing women to kind of keep themselves so small. It's like we're not letting us live up to our full potential, our full capacity, like because we're not eating. And it was just, I don't know, like it was just kind of this shift for me in thinking about how like our culture and society really does limit women in what we're able to do by telling us, just don't eat over 1,200 calories or something
Right.
ridiculous like that, right?
Yeah. I remember that. I mean, that in my own recovery journey too, of taking that risk, having similar fear, taking the risk, and then seeing, wait, the same, like just what you're saying, wait a minute, what have I been doing this whole time? I
Yeah.
actually feel so much better, can still perform, and all of these things. And wow, buying into this lie of
Yeah.
that this was what was needed. And if performance matters, we had to sacrifice. And we didn't have to sacrifice. And I didn't have to sacrifice. Yeah, I think I love that story. Yeah, I remember that story in your book. And I love that the team made a systemic change.
Yeah.
It's
It was,
fantastic.
yeah. I mean, that whole idea, right, of deprivation and like that is just a given in sport, right? You just need to deprive your body, but it's so contradicting. Like it doesn't make sense in
Yeah.
so many ways, right? Like in terms of if you actually want to perform, I don't know, maybe you need some
Yeah. We need
calories.
a lot. We need a lot of food. We need
Yes.
a lot of food. Yeah. Before we kind of as we get closer to the end of this interview, I was curious if you had any other research or books or people that you'd want to highlight for further learning. Of course, I would love all of listeners to get your book. And I'm also just curious if you know of, there's other people you'd want to highlight or resources you'd want to highlight.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the Female Athlete Conference in Boston. The next one's going to be in June 2025. It is, it's a pretty much who's who in this field in terms of research, but it is also geared towards athletes and coaches and parents. So, I mean, if anyone's in the Boston area, they actually also do it virtually too. I think you can watch the sessions virtually. So that's a great resource. There's a new book coming out June 18th called The Price She Pays: Confronting the Hidden Mental Health Crisis in Women's Sports from the Schoolyard to the Stadium. It's by Katie Steele and Tiffany Brown, and also with Aaron Strout writing too. So Aaron's like an amazing journalist in the running world. But it's a fantastic book too, and it talks. I think of it as it's actually a really nice kind of companion piece to my book because it really takes right this idea of like if you are marginalized from sport, if the system of sport and science does not reflect your lived experience, what does that kind of do to you mentally and psychologically and emotionally? And so it kind of talks through a lot of those different issues. It offers a lot of really concrete guidance to parents and coaches and athletes themselves. So I think it'll be a really great resource as well. And then so the last person I would want to shout out on social media, one of my favorite people to follow is Alyssa Olenek. Her handle is Doc Liss, Lyss,
Okay, and
fit,
we'll
I
put it in
think.
put
Yeah,
it in the show
I'll
note
send it.
links.
I'll send it to
Yeah,
you.
great.
But she's fantastic. She actually has her PhD in exercise physiology. She studies, female athlete health, and particularly has been doing a lot of work around menopause. But she's also, run some fitness programs herself as well. But she does a great job in terms of just getting really good science-backed information out on social media. She also debunks some stuff as well. And she's just great on social media and kind of really, I think, does an amazing job with that platform, in terms of communicating these messages.
Cool. Oh, good. I'm excited to add to the list for Opal too. That's great. Well, yeah. Is there anything that you would like to share that we didn't get to? Anything that you feel like is missing from this conversation?
No, I mean, the only thing I would say, right, like I think it is just having these conversations that are really important, that we are talking about these topics that we haven't felt comfortable talking about in so long. And really for me, the purpose of that is, like I said, really encouraging people to become body literate right? In terms of just knowing and understanding your own body, because we haven't been taught that. We haven't been taught to pay attention. We haven't been taught like what everything kind of does or and should be doing. We haven't been taught like how amazing our bodies are. And like, I feel like that's such an important thing, because otherwise it's so easy for these myths to be like put onto you, right? And for you to take up those narratives as like, my menstrual cycle's bad, my boobs are, terrible. Whereas like, yes, like boobs can be really annoying and like uncomfortable and all of that, but it's also just part of your physiology, right? In the same way that your menstrual cycle is just part of your physiology. It's neither good nor bad. It's like it is part of you, and something that like we need to know and understand, just as we like pay attention to like our heartbeat or our pulse and heart rate and cardiovascular fitness and all of those things. Like it's all part of your functioning body.
Yeah. I just had this fantasy, Christine, of your book being required reading in health class for high school. How amazing would that be?
That would be pretty amazing.
Amazing. Because still, having teenagers in high school, the stuff that's getting taught in health class is often perpetuating the myths. It's not giving the correct science. And imagine if all the teenage girls and boys and non-binary
boys
and non-binary athletes, trans athletes, students were all reading this in health class. Oh,
Yeah.
dream.
My poor kids are like, they're both boys. They're like, are you talking about periods again? Like, oh, yes, we know. We understand.
Yeah.
Okay, whatever.
But how good for boys to understand too
No,
about,
totally.
that would be my dream. That'd be my dream. Okay, well, thank you so much, Christine, for being on today's episode. We'll definitely link all of the things that you mentioned in our notes. And if you're listening, including your incredible book, which again, for all of you listeners, I recommend highly and hope that you get it. So if you're interested in Opal and you want to learn more, please visit us at opalfoodandbody.com. Thanks to David Bazzi for editing, Jack Straw Cultural Center for sound engineering, and Aaron Davidson for Appetite's original music. See you next time.